Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Last Sunday, my mother looked me in the eye, in front of the whole family, and announced that my brother should inherit the house because, in her words, he needed it more. I sat there, keeping my face calm even though inside my stomach turned. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if my years of responsibility, the bills I had covered, and the repairs I had quietly handled meant nothing. My brother sat back with that smug expression that has followed him all his life, the look of someone who expects everything to be handed to him without ever lifting a finger. And I thought to myself, they have no idea what I already know, and they have no clue what I have already done. The truth is, this entire showdown had been building for months, maybe years if I am honest. My brother Mark has always been the golden child. He was the one who tried hard, even when his efforts led nowhere. He was the one who needed a little help, even when the help stretched into decades. And I was the reliable one, the one they didn't worry about, the one who was told, "You're capable, you'll figure it out." When bills piled up, they were slipped to me. When chores went undone, I picked them up. And when my father died, I became the invisible safety net no one thanked, but everyone used. It all started to boil over earlier this year when I stopped by to help with dinner and noticed an envelope taped to the fridge. It had a bright red strip across the top and the county seal. My mom brushed it off, saying Mark was taking care of it. I knew better. I opened it quietly while no one was looking and saw the words "delinquent property taxes" in big bold letters. The amount wasn't small either. If those taxes weren't brought current, the house could end up in lien sale, and once that happens, there's almost no way to undo the damage. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't decide if I was angry at my mom for trusting him or furious at Mark for letting things slip this far. That night, I logged in to check the county website myself. I entered the property information and watched as the unpaid balance loaded. It was worse than the letter suggested. Not just late taxes, there were penalties stacked on top. If no one stepped up, the house wasn't just in danger, it was practically being handed to debt collectors. And yet, no one seemed to care. Mom dismissed it. Mark promised he was on it. But weeks went by and nothing changed. I knew if I didn't act, we would lose the house altogether, and the irony of that possibility almost made me laugh. My mom wanted Mark to inherit the home, yet under his watch, it would vanish to the county auction before he even had the chance. I took matters into my own hands. I paid one installment just to stop the penalties from climbing further. It wasn't easy, it was a lot of money, but I considered it the price of protecting something my parents worked for their entire lives. I didn't tell them. I wanted to see if anyone else would step up. Of course, no one did. What I discovered next made me angrier than the unpaid taxes. There's a tenant in the basement apartment, Mrs. Alvarez, a sweet older woman who has been there for years. She told me, without realizing how explosive her words were, that she had been paying Mark directly in cash every month. She trusted him, thought he was just the one collecting for the household. But there were no receipts, no records, nothing but cash disappearing into his pocket while the house went deeper into debt. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just cleaning up laziness, I was covering outright theft. So I stopped the bleeding. I set up every account, water, gas, electric, under my control. I made sure the bills were linked to my email, and I quietly removed Mark's phone number from the login settings. I wanted to see his reaction the next time he tried to log in and found himself locked out. It was a small revenge, but it felt like reclaiming ground that had been stolen from me for years. For once, he wasn't going to manipulate his way through with charm or excuses. A week later, another letter came. This one was harsher. It stated that if the taxes weren't fully paid within a specific window, the property could move into lien sale and eventually be auctioned off. I sat at the table, reading it carefully, and said quietly to myself, if anyone is going to save this home, it's going to be me. And it's going to be done right. I didn't announce it. I didn't brag. I just folded the letter, slid it into my growing binder of evidence, and made up my mind. If my mother and brother thought they could treat me like the background character in my own family, they were about to learn that I had been keeping score. And this time, I wasn't playing nice. The look on Mark's face when Mrs. Alvarez handed him a check instead of cash, made out directly to the property, was priceless. He tried to cover it with a laugh, saying, "Oh, she's just confused." But she told him I had set everything up properly. He didn't argue with me directly. He just scowled, and I could see the gears in his head spinning, already trying to figure out how to spin the story. That was only the beginning. Because while he was worrying about losing his cash stream, I was planning something much bigger, something that would flip the entire family's power dynamic upside down. And none of them saw it coming. What came next wasn't just about bills or rent. It was about ownership, control, and finally making them realize that I wasn't the problem solver they could use and ignore. I was the one holding the cards, and soon, the proof would be undeniable. When I finally accepted that no one else was going to lift a finger to stabilize the house and that the polite reminders and patient explanations were being treated like background noise, I took a day off work, put my binder in my bag, and drove downtown to the county building where a man at a counter with a nameplate that read Mr. Patel walked me through, in plain English and without a hint of judgment, exactly what would keep a roof over my mother's head and stop the slow bleed that my brother insisted on calling a rough patch, and as he spoke about delinquent taxes, redemption windows, and the difference between panicking and filing the right paper at the right time, I felt something in me settle, because this was finally a field where effort actually mattered, and because for the first time in a long time I was not arguing feelings, I was working with facts. He explained that once the taxes were brought current, I could record a notice that would make it harder for anyone to play games with title, and that if my mother agreed, there was a clean path to protect the property without dragging our grief and our resentment through a courtroom, which was to move the house into a small living trust where my mother could keep the right to live there for the rest of her life, while I served as trustee to manage the bills, the tenant, and the repairs, and that upon her passing the house would pass to me without probate or cousins or aunts camping out in the process. And while he said it all with the patient rhythm of someone who has seen a lot of families make the same avoidable mistakes, I heard the translation that fit my reality, which was that I could keep my mother safe, keep the lights on, and shut down my brother's cash collection without starting a war I had no interest in fighting. I paid the full past due balance that afternoon, not because I wanted a medal, but because letting penalties grow felt like watching someone vandalize a photo of my father. And when the receipt printed and the cashier stamped it with that heavy clunk that echoes across a counter, I slid it into the front of my binder like a shield, then walked to the recorder's office where I asked, very directly, what needed to be done so that a relative with a talent for excuses could not refinance a sign or promise away what he did not own, and the clerk, who had the quiet voice of a person who has seen every kind of family storm, handed me a simple form to record a notice of my interest and a packet about a transfer to a revocable trust, and she told me where to find a notary who would not make it complicated. That evening I sat with my mother at the kitchen table, and instead of making it a morality lecture or a referendum on my brother's character, I laid out a timeline with dates and receipts, showed the tax statements, the utility shut-off warnings, the insurance letter that said the policy would lapse without proof of payment, and I told her calmly that I had already paid enough to stop the penalties and that I was prepared to finish the job, but that I would only do it if we moved from hope to structure, because hope was how we got here, and structure was how we would get out, and my mother, who had spent years balancing worry about money with worry about keeping the peace, rubbed the edge of the table with her thumb and said in a low voice that my father used to tell her that I understood paper better than arguments. And then she looked at me without blinking and asked whether this plan protected her right to live in the house without anyone pushing her out, and I said that was the first line of the trust document, and that it would be written in plain words no one could spin. The next day we met a mobile notary at the house, and my mother signed the deed that transferred the property into the Maple Street Trust, with me as trustee and with a life estate for her spelled out so directly that even a bored cousin could understand it. And we signed a short, clear trust declaration that said I would manage the bills and the tenant without charging a fee, that I would keep receipts and open a dedicated account, and that the house would be hers to live in for the rest of her natural life. And when the notary left, My mother touched my shoulder and said that she felt like she could breathe again even if she could already hear the complaints that would start when my brother realized he was no longer the gatekeeper to the basement and the person who got thanked for collecting envelopes he never opened. I took those signed pages straight back to the recorder, waited for the stamps, and then walked to the insurance office where I updated the policy so the trust was the named insured and my mother's life estate was acknowledged in writing, and when I left, I called Mrs. Alvarez and told her gently that all future rent would be by check or transfer to the account for the property, that she would receive a typed receipt every time, and that no one was to ask her for cash in a hallway ever again. And she exhaled in a way that told me she had been worried about this dance for longer than I understood, and she thanked me for making it simple. I wish I could say the quiet competence of those 2 days impressed my brother, or that it inspired a moment of adult responsibility, but predictably, he pivoted from charm to offense. And within hours a family group chat appeared with a title that said house plan and a chorus of messages about how he should be the one to carry the home because he had more need and because sons keep legacies, and my aunt, who loves a verdict as long as she is the one delivering it, chimed in with a speech about tradition and the importance of keeping property with the man of the family, and I read each line with the calm of a person holding documents that spoke louder than speeches, then typed exactly nothing. Because there is a kind of silence that is not surrender but setup. Before the weekend, I recorded one more simple document, a memorandum of trust that would inform any title search that the house was held and managed by the trust, which meant no surprise signatures, no last-minute loans, no backroom deals with fast-talking brokers, and after I slid that stamped page into my binder behind the tax receipts and the insurance confirmation, I poured a glass of water, opened the group chat again, and watched as the messages piled up about fairness, sacrifice, and what my father would have wanted, even though my father, who believed in ledgers and follow-through, would have pointed at the binder and said that whoever keeps the book keeps the house. By Sunday afternoon the invitations had been issued for a family dinner where, as my aunt put it with an overeager string of exclamation points, we would settle the future of the home like civilized people. And although I could feel the old reflex tugging at me to argue my case in advance or to send scans and links and explanations, I chose a different posture because sometimes the most generous thing you can do for people who love a story is let them finish telling it right up until the moment the facts walk into the room, which is why I zipped the binder, checked that every tab had a stamped page behind it, and let the group chat continue to warm itself on opinions, knowing that opinions cool very quickly when placed next to recorded truth. By the time the so-called family meeting rolled around, I already knew exactly what was waiting for me, because the group chat had been buzzing for days with little hints, veiled threats, and overly polite reminders that we needed to talk things through before things got ugly. The language alone was enough to make me laugh, because what they called talking was never anything close to a conversation. It was a pile-on where my brother presented himself as the victim of circumstance, my Aunt Carol acted as the family judge and jury, and my mother sat torn between wanting peace and not wanting to admit that her son had been bleeding the house dry for years. I walked into the living room with my binder in hand, not to perform or defend myself, but because I knew the performance was theirs to give, and I wanted to be ready when it collapsed under the weight of a single receipt. The moment I sat down, Carol cleared her throat like a teacher beginning class, and she launched into a speech about tradition and about how every family has to think of the next generation, and how in her mind there was no question that Mark, being the son, being the one with more need, should inherit the house and carry it forward. She kept saying carry it forward as though this were some noble mission, not a property that had been teetering on the brink of tax foreclosure only weeks earlier. My brother sat with his arms folded, leaning back with that practiced smirk, the one that said he already knew how the story would end, because in his head, stories always ended with him being bailed out. I let them all speak. I let my aunt finish her monologue. I let my brother explain that his plans were just around the corner, that his business was about to take off, that he just needed the stability of the house in his name to really get momentum. I let my mother, reluctantly, say that she thought it might be true that men had an easier time holding property, that she didn't want to cause a fight, that she just wanted everyone to feel secure. And then, when the circle of justifications had been exhausted and the room started to look at me for the expected argument, I didn't argue. I unzipped the binder, pulled out a neat stack of receipts for property taxes, utilities, and insurance, all dated and stamped, and laid them in the center of the table like cards in a poker game. There was a silence that followed which no speech could cut through. I told them calmly that while they were debating hypotheticals and planning futures, I had been paying the present, and that from this moment forward, no money conversation about the house would pass through anyone else but the trustee. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't gloat, I didn't insult. I just stated it as a fact. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying I was being dramatic, but when I slid across the notice from the recorder's office showing the Maple Street Trust, signed, stamped, and filed, his face lost a little of its color. My aunt, of course, tried to recover, saying documents can be challenged, that families should talk before making such decisions, but I reminded her that families had had every opportunity to talk, and what they had done instead was delay, excuse, and hope someone else would carry the burden. I pointed to the receipts and said, "This is what carrying actually looks like." My mother looked down at the table, her thumb rubbing the edge of the paper as though she was trying to read the truth through touch alone, and then she asked a question that stung more than all the speeches combined. "Are you protecting me, or are you taking from me?" For a moment, my throat closed up, because after everything I had done, after covering bills, after preventing foreclosure, after setting up a life estate for her that guaranteed she could live here without fear until the day she died, she still wondered if I was the thief. But I steadied myself and told her the truth, that this house was her home for as long as she wanted, that not a single person could push her out because the first line of the trust declared it, and that what I was protecting her from wasn't me, but from the very people who were now arguing for tradition, while quietly hoping I would keep paying their way. She asked me to prove it, and so I slid the trust declaration across the table, pointing to the clause that granted her a life estate in black and white. She read it silently, and when she set the page down, her shoulders lowered as if some invisible weight had finally shifted. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't question me again either, and sometimes silence speaks louder than gratitude. Meanwhile, Mark wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and waved a text message at me, one he had clearly drafted with Mrs. Alvarez in mind, claiming she had offered him an extra month's rent in advance. He wanted to show that he was still the one she trusted. What he didn't realize was that Mrs. Alvarez had already sent me a photo of that very text, confused and worried, asking if she should respond. I had told her not to, and so when he tried to present it as proof of his legitimacy, I calmly said, "Funny, because she already sent me that screenshot, and I told her to ignore it." The look on his face was worth every sleepless night I had spent balancing numbers in my head. He sputtered, tried to explain that it was just a misunderstanding, but no one was listening anymore, not even Aunt Carol, who looked more annoyed with him for getting caught than with me for taking control. I pulled one more document from the binder, a certified notice addressed directly to him, served that morning, requiring him to stop collecting rent immediately and to remove his belongings from the furnace room by a specific date due to safety hazards. I handed it to him across the table, and the fact that he had already signed for it, his signature scrawled on the delivery slip, left him with no ground to stand on. He shoved the paper back at me, muttering that I was turning the family against him, but the truth was that he had done that himself years ago. I was just the first person willing to call it what it was. The meeting ended not with a resolution, but with a crack in the image my brother had carefully curated, and for once, I didn't leave feeling exhausted or defeated. I left knowing that the fight was no longer about opinions or loyalties. It was about documented truth, and I had more of that in my binder than he would ever have in his excuses. What lingered, though, was my mother's question, echoing in my head as I drove home. Was I protecting her, or was I taking from her? I knew the answer, but I also knew that until the final reveal came, until the full weight of what I had built landed on that Sunday dinner table, there would always be doubt. And that was fine with me, because sometimes doubt is the perfect cover for preparation. What none of them understood was that I wasn't done. Not even close. When the dust of that tense living room exchange settled, I realized the real battle was not just over the house itself, but over the story being told about me, because while I had documentation and legal protections neatly stacked in my binder, my brother had a talent for spreading half-truths and for twisting silence into confession, and my relatives had always been far more eager to listen to the most dramatic version of events than to ask for proof. Within days, I began hearing from cousins who asked why I was pushing mom out, why I was taking control for myself, and why I couldn't just let my brother have his chance. The fact that none of them had seen a single receipt, a single tax notice, or even an electric bill did not matter, because Mark had already whispered his version to them, framing himself as the struggling son with dreams and me as the cold, calculating daughter who thought she was better than everyone. I knew if I didn't strike back, not with anger but with clarity, the rumor would harden into fact, and that was something I could not allow. So I spent an entire evening laying everything out in a single email, not a dramatic rant, not a defensive essay, but a timeline that began with the first past due tax notice and ended with the signed deed transferring the house into the Maple Street Trust. I attached every stamped page, every receipt for utilities, every confirmation of insurance paid, and I highlighted the line in the trust that spelled out in plain language that my mother had the right to live in the home for the rest of her natural life, without condition, without rent, and without interference. I sent the email to every relative who had even a passing stake in the gossip network, and when I pressed send, I knew that I had cut off my brother's most valuable weapon, ambiguity. He thrived when no one knew the truth, when everything lived in the haze of memory and opinion. But when confronted with clear, dated documents, there was nothing left for him to spin except insults, and even those began to sound weak compared to the cold weight of a stamped record. Of course, he didn't stop. He went louder, turning to phone calls instead of texts, to casual visits instead of messages, showing up at cousins' houses with charm and explanations about how he had been blindsided. He told them that I had tricked our mother into signing, that I was cutting him out of the family legacy, that everything I had done was driven by greed. What he didn't realize was that the louder he shouted, the more foolish he looked, because each claim he made was directly contradicted by the documents everyone now had sitting in their inbox. It's hard to sell a story about being pushed out when the first clause of the trust states in black and white that our mother cannot be displaced. It's hard to claim theft when receipts show thousands of dollars in bills paid by me, while he offered none. And so, little by little, his credibility cracked, not because I argued harder, but because I didn't need to argue at all. I also met with Mrs. Alvarez and formalized her tenancy through a written lease signed under the trust's name, complete with an account where every dollar of rent would land, and I promised her she would never again be asked for cash in a hallway or for extra months that disappeared without explanation. She told me she had always been uncomfortable with the way my brother handled things, but never wanted to create tension, and I reminded her that tenants should never carry the burden of family politics. I gave her copies of every page she signed, and I slid the originals into my binder, not because I feared she would turn against me, but because I had learned never to leave anything undocumented. The more evidence I held, the fewer words I would ever need to say. Still, I knew reputations are not only about paperwork, but also about perception, and perception in my family was often cemented around one event, Sunday dinner. So when my mother announced that everyone was invited, that the future of the house would be discussed once and for all, I understood that the stage was being set for a final verdict in the court of family opinion. My Aunt Carol sent a flurry of exclamation points into the chat, practically glowing at the chance to preside over yet another tribunal. Mark, emboldened, wrote finally, as though this were the showdown he had been waiting for, as if the noise he had spread would somehow drown out the sound of a notarized seal. I did not argue. I did not warn. I let the anticipation build, and while they rehearsed speeches, I prepared files. I went back to the recorder's office and filed a memorandum of trust, an additional layer of public notice that meant no one could attempt a refinance or transfer without tripping over my recorded interest. I walked out with the stamped copy and slid it behind the trust declaration in my binder, sealing another door before they even thought to try opening it. The house was no longer vulnerable to charm, to gossip, or to sudden signatures scribbled in desperation. It was fortified not with opinions, but with legal weight. The following days were filled with whispers and sideways looks, relatives texting me vague questions to test whether I would reveal my hand before dinner. I answered none of them. I knew that the power of what I held came not only from the documents themselves, but from the timing of their reveal, and the most devastating moment to unveil the truth would be at the very table where they had declared me selfish, controlling, and unworthy. Each hour I stayed silent, the more confident Mark became, mistaking my quiet for weakness, when in reality it was nothing more than preparation. On Friday evening, as the invitations were finalized and as my mother nervously fussed about everyone getting along, I zipped the binder one more time, checked that each divider had its evidence tucked firmly inside, and sat back with a clarity I had never felt before. For years, I had been cast as the fixer, the quiet one, the dependable one who carried burdens without thanks, the one they could lean on while dismissing her voice. But now, the roles were shifting, and whether they admitted it or not, Sunday dinner would no longer be about what my brother needed or what my aunt decreed. It would be about proof versus noise, structure versus chaos, truth versus gossip. And as I laid the binder on the table beside me, I realized that the battle for reputation was already over, because while Mark had wasted his energy spinning stories into the wind, I had been building a wall of receipts and seals that no gust could topple. The question wasn't whether I would win at dinner. The only question left was how loudly the silence would hit them when they realized the outcome had been decided long before they ever sharpened their speeches. By the time Sunday dinner began, the room felt like a courtroom that had not yet called the case, because every nod, every cleared throat, and every carefully placed dish seemed less about hospitality and more about rehearsed positions that would be delivered as closing arguments. Yet I took my seat without flinching, placed the binder beside my plate, and let the ritual start with the same small talk that families use like gauze when they know a cut is coming and they are hoping the bleeding looks polite. My Aunt Carol arrived with a speech already balanced on the tip of her tongue. My brother wore the practiced half-smile of a man who believes he can charm a verdict with tone rather than evidence, and my mother, who had never asked to be judge or witness in any of this, kept glancing at me as if checking whether the ground beneath her would hold long enough to hear one more explanation that did not ask her to choose between her children. When plates were full and the hum of forks stopped pretending to be peace, my mother cleared her throat and said the line they had clearly agreed she would say, the line that was supposed to crown the entire evening with inevitable tradition, that my brother should inherit the house because he needed it more. And she added the most dangerous word in any family dispute, the word always, as in he has always needed more, and I have always been capable, which is the kind of sentence that can quietly erase a lifetime of work with a shrug. I did not correct her, I did not argue, and I did not ask whether Need had ever once paid a bill, because instead I unzipped the binder, slid out a transparent sleeve with the recorded deed transferring the property into the Maple Street Trust, placed it between the serving bowl and my mother's hand, and said with a calmness that felt like a muscle I had spent months training, that it was strange to talk about who should own the house when the county already recognized the owner, and that the owner was the trust one managed, and that the very first clause guaranteed my mother a life estate so broad and so clear that even the most stubborn relative would run out of adjectives before they found a way to argue her out of it. The room went quiet in the theatrical way silence behaves when it realizes it is finally the loudest thing in the world, and I watched the eyes move across the stamps and signatures and the printed recording information. The bureaucratic poetry that had become my shield. My brother reached for bluster as if it were oxygen, insisting that I had blindsided him, that I had tricked our mother, that I had moved behind everyone's backs to grab what was not mine, and I let him spill every accusation he had stored up. Because I knew what was coming next would empty those words of air, I slid a second envelope across the table, addressed to him, holding a ledger that showed every month of cash he had collected from the basement tenant, matched against a newly signed under the trust, with the dedicated account and deposit slips attached, and I told him, without heat and without apology, that there were now two clear options available to him if he wanted to live in the house. That he could rent a room at a fair market rate under a written agreement like any other adult, or he could move out by the end of next month with a written checklist of the belongings he would remove from the furnace room to restore basic safety, and that either path would be honored. Without drama, so long as he finally respected the difference between family love and financial gravity. He sputtered, he frowned, he accused me of cruelty, and I reminded him that cruelty would have been letting the county sell the house for back taxes while he pocketed rent in cash, whereas what I was offering was structure and dignity. The kind of grown-up solution he had claimed, for years, he was ready to handle. My aunt tried one last pivot to sentiment, suggesting that our father would be heartbroken to see his children fighting over property, and I answered with the simplest sentence of the night, that our father believed in receipts, that he taught me to keep paper because people forget and paper does not, and that if love had any place in this conversation, then it was in the pages that kept a roof over my mother's head without asking her to gamble on anyone's promises. I opened a third folder and placed in front of my mother a letter from the tax office showing that the delinquent balance was paid in full and that the next installments were prepaid through the end of the year, along with the updated insurance declaration naming the trust and acknowledging her life estate, and I told her that no one, not a lender and not a relative and not an overeager cousin with a pen, could move the title without passing through me, and that I would not move a thing that endangered her security for as long as she drew breath. Something shifted in that moment that had nothing to do with signatures and everything to do with posture, because my mother reached out, not for the paper, but for my hand. And while she did not apologize for the years in which my capability had been convenient for everyone, she said the only words I had needed to hear, that she understood, that she believed me, and that the house felt safe for the first time since my father was gone. My brother began to speak again, but fell silent when I placed a fourth envelope near his plate, a simple printout of the certified notice he had already signed for, the one ending his hallway collections and giving him a deadline to clear the mechanical room. And I watched him read his own signature like someone deciphering a map that led back to the place he never imagined he would stand, which was the place where the rules also applied to him. I had saved one final move, not because I needed flourish, but because I wanted the room to understand that this plan had never been about hoarding or humiliation. So I opened a thin stack of small checks made out to the cousin's kids' college funds with a note on each memo line that said, "From the house that stays in the family," and I explained that as long as the property generated responsible rent, after taxes and repairs and insurance, the surplus would seed small scholarships for the next generation, and that no one would owe me gratitude for that because the arrangement was recorded, audited, and transparent. Aunt Carol, who could argue with anyone for sport, stared at the recorder's stamps as if they were hieroglyphs spelling out the new family order, and for once she had nothing to say. When the table finally exhaled, the air felt different, less heavy with old roles and more clean with realized boundaries, and while I know this does not turn us into a perfect family, and while I know my brother will need time to relearn how adulthood actually functions, the pattern that kept me quietly carrying everyone else ended that night without a single raised voice and without a single insult that needed to be swallowed. The victory, if that is even the right word for something so simple and so overdue, was not about conquest or humiliation. It was about building a structure that outlived speeches, about letting the truth arrive in a folder and speak in stamps, about refusing to be the fixer who pays and disappears, and becoming instead the architect who writes the terms and keeps her promise. When the plates were cleared and the house settled into its normal creaks, my mother kissed my cheek and squeezed my fingers. My brother walked to his car with a deadline and a choice. And I closed the binder knowing that I did not win because I was louder or meaner or more cunning. I won because I prepared, because I wrote it down, and because I finally decided that my capability was not a burden to exploit but a power to use. And that is how the house stayed ours and how I made sure it belonged, at last, to someone who would not waste it.